Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Baltimore. Patriotic Millionaires, that's an organization formed in 2010 to urge President Obama to let the Bush tax cuts expire. They're a group now of about 200 millionaires. You got to have at least $1 million to get in. And they advocate economic and social equality and tax reform essentially that rich people should in fact pay more taxes, meaning the members of this organization are saying they should pay more taxes. Well, how did that organization and its chairman react to the debate on Monday night, where we heard both Trump and Clinton suggest what their tax ideas and programmatic ideas for the economy would be? So now joining us from New York City is Morris Pearl. He currently serves, as I said, as chairman of the Patriotic Millionaires. He was at BlackRock, Inc., where his work included the maiden lane transactions and assessing the government's potential losses from bank bailouts in the United States and in Europe. And I guess you must be a millionaire. Thanks for joining us, Morris.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Great to be on your show.
So, you issued a statement after the debate on Monday night where you were critical of the host, Mr. Holt, suggesting he should have asked questions that went unasked and thus unanswered. What didn't he ask that you wanted asked?
Well, I'll tell you what we believe the fundamental problem is in America is there's a small group of wealthy people, like one of the candidates, who's using their money to get more political power, using their political power to get more money. And that's the problem, is that political power is being concentrated in a very small number of people. And we'd like to see and hear what the candidates, well, if they approve of that, if they think that's a good thing or a bad thing. And if they think it's a bad thing, I'd like to know what they can do about it or what they propose to do about it as president of the United States.
Now, to be fair, both candidates would easily join your organization. The Clintons are multi-millionaires, perhaps not billionaires. Of course, we're not really sure how much money Trump actually has. Some people suggesting he doesn't have as much as he says he does. But they're both quite wealthy, just to make sure.
That's true.
Yeah. So if you'd been moderating, what question would you have asked, and then what would you like to hear as an answer?
Well, I'd like to know what they can do to allow more people to participate in our democratic process. Part of our problem is that we have so much money needs to be raised. The candidates have to be very responsive to these major donors. They spend a lot of time fundraising, and they have to spend a lot of time with the few rich people who donate most of the money. I know, I don't know if it's true or not, but the Boston Globe said I'm number 674 in the donor list. And believe me, I spend a lot more time with senators and congresspeople than the average American does. And I'd like to see a system that we can get more people participating in the system, participating not just walking into the voting booth and voting, but actually having the same kind of access to their elected representatives. Something like what we have in New York City, where a person who wants to run for city council has to get 1,000 people or so to donate only $100 or $200, and then get some matching funds and has a few $100,000 to use to run a campaign. That system has allowed, since it's been initiated a few years back, has allowed a whole different group of people to run for city council. We no longer have a big representation of people involved in real estate development, but we have a much larger representation from minorities, from people who are less well-to-do, from people who come from less well-to-do neighborhoods and backgrounds. And it's really changed the face of the city council here in New York. Right. And things like that have been successful in other places like Maine, Connecticut, Seattle. So that's the kind of thing I'd like to see.
Now, you start by saying the core of the problem is too much wealth in too few hands, if I understand correctly. But do you find either Trump or Clinton really seriously addressing that? I mean, clearly, Trump is talking about massive tax cuts for the wealthy, but is Hillary Clinton talking about much more than that?
Well, she's talked about a few things. Just in terms of, for instance, the estate tax. The estate tax is what makes America a meritocracy instead of an aristocracy. It's what prevents the small number of billionaires from just having families that remain rich forever without having to work. Mr. Trump wishes to remove the estate tax altogether. That would mean essentially his descendants would never ever have to work for a living or pay taxes forever. Ms. Clinton wants to make the estate tax larger so that only 99.7% of the population is exempt from it, and but that 0.3% of the population is the wealthiest and would have to pay an estate tax as the wealth moves from one generation to the next. And she would actually increase the amount of it so that people who leave wealth to their children over $1 billion would have to pay at higher rate than they do now. And we think that's correct, that billionaires should pay more taxes.
I know there's been a great debate in the estate tax about what's the threshold for paying a tax. I think at one point during the Eisenhower years, the estate tax was 90%. If my memory serves me right, the threshold was about max maybe $1 million, maybe less. Then some people were pushing for $5 million. I don't really know the Clinton proposal very well. What is her threshold? Is it at $1 billion, or she doesn't eliminate estate taxes at levels of $5 million and more, does she?
No. It would be a 0 through around 3-point-something million, then 40%, and then over $1 billion, it would go up to 65%.
Well, that's significant.
Yeah.
And that would be a mix of state and federal, or just a straight federal tax?
Well, federal. It's just the federal tax I'm talking about. I mean, certain states have a state tax. I think most states don't have a state tax anyway here in the United States.
And what else would you like to see? Either you're hearing it from Clinton, or what would you like to be hearing or not hearing?
Well, I'd like to see a variety of things. I'd like to see, for instance, mandatory disclosure of corporate money that's used for politics. I don't think it's right that corporations, the managers of corporations, should be able to use their shareholders' money on politics without even the shareholders themselves who own the corporations knowing what they're doing. We've talked about a number of reasons why that's bad, and has come to really hurt companies. When the shareholders of some of the pharmaceutical companies that make a lot of money selling contraceptives found that their management was using their money to help candidates who were trying to ban their products, that caused some backlash, and some of those owners were not happy with what was going on. We think that's the kind of thing that should not be allowed. We think the president could and should require disclosure of political spending by federal contractors. It's obviously ripe for corruption when someone is trying to make money by selling something to the government and is giving money to government officials. That just seems like something that the public should know about. So we think there's a variety of things that could be and should be done to improve the situation between disclosure and some kind of a funding arrangement so more people can run for office without needing so much money.
One of the debates between Sanders and Clinton during the primaries, and one of the critiques Sanders made of Clinton, he asked her to make a pledge that she wouldn't have her finance team come from Wall Street. He never came out and said the way President Obama did, I guess for tactical reasons. He didn't want to critique President Obama, but clearly the 07-08 crisis dealt with by President Obama with a finance team that came from Wall Street, and much of it the former Bill Clinton team. We know that since the supposed recovery, 90% of post-recovery income has gone to 1% of the population, which has a lot to do with how the crisis was managed. And what Sanders challenged Clinton not to have that kind of team, which she wouldn't. And a lot of the disparity in wealth and concentration of wealth has happened because of the power of finance. And do you see from Clinton, or what would you like to see, any real measures that would break up that power?
Well, I think we've made some progress. I think things like the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, which Mr. Cordray is in charge of, he had been the Attorney General in Indiana previously, is making a difference. I think that the some of the reforms under the Dodd-Frank rules are making a difference. But I think you're right. I think there's some things that President Obama did not do well. I think that appointing Mary Jo White to the SEC turned out to be a major step in the wrong direction in terms of disclosure of political spending of this sort. And yeah, she and her husband both came from the corporate finance world. So yeah, I'd like to see not necessarily people who don't know anything about finance being appointed to these jobs, but I'd like to see people who are responsive to the general public, even in areas where the general public's interests differs from the interests of the financial services industry.
Well, what do you make of the team that's around her that looks like will be the transition team and the advisors? Because she's already received a lot of criticism that it's essentially the same kind of thinking that led to Bill Clinton and Bill Clinton's bubble creation and the growth, the demolition of elimination of Glass-Steagall, and even though I think that in itself gets somewhat a little overrated how important Glass-Steagall was, but it's an indication of how powerful finance was and
Well,
promotion of deregulation.
yeah, I mean, you can't say any one law or regulation was the problem. But yeah, I think that separating commercial banking and investment banking is probably a good idea. Normal commercial bank, the kind of banks that have ATM machines where you have your paycheck deposited and you go and take out money every week. That sort of thing is almost a necessity and is almost like a public utility. That's as important to you as your cable TV, as your local telephone service, maybe not quite the level of your electricity, but close. Whereas investment banking, well, that's something that doesn't really need to be regulated as much. So I think having the two separated has a lot of merit going for it. I think there are people on Secretary Clinton's transition team who do know a lot about these issues, people like Neera Tanden from Center for American Progress, and hopefully other people who are very well aware of these issues and can put into policy-making places people that can make a difference. I think that the president is almost sort of leading by philosophy. It's not so much every detailed decision that gets made, because most of the enforcement of the rules is done by these sort of independent agencies, like the SEC, which isn't, not a at the pleasure appointment anyway. But the Treasury is more of an administering this huge body of rules and making decisions at the margin. And I think it is important of, who is sort of advising the president on what policies to pursue, what the goals should be, what the philosophy should be, is important. And
yeah, and there's been zero critique by Hillary Clinton of President Obama's economic handling. Quite the contrary, she more or less promises to continue that legacy. But that legacy had a lot to do with the way the Fed has been shoveling money to the big banks virtually unconditionally, practically at zero interest rate, with no requirement to actually invest in the economy. We know a lot of the banks that are borrowing money for practically zero, get involved in this carry trade where they go loan money to Brazil's and other hot money markets and just make money off the point spread. There's a tremendous encouragement of this, I don't know what else you would call it, very parasitical speculation, which has become the sort of the dominant play in much of Wall Street. If she doesn't critique that, why would anyone think she'll do it any differently?
well, I think your point is well taken. I remember, Michael Douglas's Gordon Gekko said, greed is good. And that's sort of been the philosophy, for the last 30 or 40 years. Well, greed is good. The invisible hand can solve problems. Well, that's not true. The invisible hand cannot solve all of the problems. Some problems need government direction or government regulation. And yeah, I don't know what's going to happen in the next administration.
If Trump is successful, who wants to essentially, if you listen to what he's saying, get rid of virtually all that kind of regulation and have tax cuts that most people say mostly benefit people at the upper tier, what does that lead to?
Well, that would lead to more inequality. That would lead to fewer people participating in our society, both civically and financially. And that would be bad for the members of my organization. What we say isn't so much that we're altruistic all the time. What we say is that we want to live in a country with a robust middle class. If you want to sell expensive ice cream, as Ben Cohen says, we need people who can afford to buy Chunky Monkey. And if you want to sell shoes, like our member Arnold Hyatt, well, he needs a lot of people who can afford to spend money on expensive shoes. We need a robust middle class filled with people who can spend money. What's more important to us as business people and investors is all of our customers getting raises. What's less important is whether we pay a little bit more or less in taxes. We need people who can make money. What I'd like to see is lots of people getting raises who can spend money and therefore help all these businesses grow.
So, you're trying to recruit people for your organization. You're talking to lots of millionaires. Not everybody you talk to joins. What you just said is such a no-brainer that if people don't have consumer purchasing power, it's going to paralyze the economy. And if too much money's in too few hands, there's only so much money wealthy people can actually spend. And this idea of Trump that if you have tax cuts, they'll put all this money into investment and all that. Well, there's already tons of money in people's hands. If
It's a
they want to
no-brainer
invest,
for
they can
you and for
invest.
me.
So
But
what's the mentality, though, when you talk to, how do people not, other millionaires and such, how do they not get the need for more purchasing power when they seem to think the real objective is to have as low wages as possible?
Well, actually, not a lot of people think that. Most people I talk to are fairly receptive to my case. Frankly, the biggest problem I have in recruiting members is people who ask me, well, how is this going to help elect Hillary Clinton to be the next president? And that's, we're nominally a nonpartisan organization, although most of our members are obviously more progressive since our positions are progressive. I think that what you and I see as no-brainers, though, the people who don't understand it are over in the Dirksen building and the Hart building and the Republican office suites in the Senate side. What we can do, which other organizations don't, is walk into a meeting with some of these 20-something-year-old economic policy staffers and explain to them that business people, when they start business, do not start with the bottom line and then work their way up. They start with how much they can sell, what they need to pay their workers, and then figure out what the profit is at the end. Republicans seem to think that businessmen start with how much profit they want to make, and from that figure out how much they can spend on wages and taxes and everything else.
But to a large extent, people in Congress and such, they're responding to lobbying efforts, and like you said, people that donate to them and get their phone calls picked up. I mean, the auto industry, part of the restructuring of the auto industry was the starting wage, this whole idea of a two-tier wage system. So now workers starting in the big three start at 14 bucks an hour. They used to start at 26 bucks an hour.
Yeah.
All through the auto parts industry. Go to many of the big manufacturers have started two-tier wages where they're getting starting workers to work at half what the starting wage used to be. Like the drive to lower wages, the drive to paralyze wage increases. I mean, if most big corporations and even mid-sized ones wanted wages to go up, it wouldn't be hard for them to raise wages. I mean, Walmart had this big fight. If you remember, Elizabeth Warren had hearings on this, and the guy from Costco made your argument. But the Walmart guys sure don't make that argument. They try to lower them as much as they possibly can get away with.
Well, yeah, that is true. I mean, not everyone agrees with us. And some people are more greedy than others. Some people are short-term greedy. Other people are long-term greedy. And that makes a difference in how you look at these policies. I don't think that too many people want the government involved in making every decision about wages and whatnot, but the government has been involved a lot over the last, during, the latter part of my lifetime of sort of regulating unions. I think the decline of organized labor has had a lot to do with the decline of wages in these sectors that you've mentioned, like the Midwest automobile makers. I think that the sort of as the power of organized labor has declined, as it's been more and more regulated by the administrations.
And you can see that, like organizations like ALEC that go around promoting
Oh, yeah.
exactly this kind of legislation everywhere are funded by big corporate donors. That's who funds ALEC.
Yes. Yeah, that's all too true. Somehow, the people, a majority of the people of Wisconsin were somehow convinced that the financial crisis was caused by teachers' unions. And you can argue about the philosophies of schools all you want, but I think that teachers are an important part of whatever you're doing, and that getting rid of unions for teachers is not good for kids.
All right, well, the discussion to be continued. Thanks very much for
Sure.
joining us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be in your show.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.